In this video, I will talk about what Metallica did in the 10 years between 1994 and 2003. The band calls this period the wilderness years. I will refer to it, a bit provocatively, I must admit, as the lost decade. As you see in the thumbnail, I have put a question mark on this phrase. In fact, at the end of the video, I will examine whether it was really a lost decade or not. For those of you who don't know, for the period we are examining, Metallica are James Hetfield, rhythm guitar and vocals, Lars Ulrich, drums, Kirk Hammett, lead guitars, and Jason Newsted, bass guitar. We will also mention their two other bass players, Cliff Burton and Robert Trujillo. I won't talk about the history of Metallica's early years because I believe everyone knows it more or less, and because I think that up to a certain point, it had a logical sequence and development and remained within the boundaries of what we call the thrash scene. However, I will say a few things about the reasons I believe led to the period I will soon call the lost decade. For me, there's no doubt that the first and most fundamental of all was the accident and the death of Cliff Burton. Many people have wondered what would have happened if the bassist had lived. There are many opinions on this. Some say Metallica's path would have been completely different. Others say it would have been exactly the same. The truth is, we can't turn back time, and we'll never know for sure. It is clear and undeniable that Cliff Burton's personality had a strong presence within the band, and that his absence cost the other three members dearly. But ultimately, what I believe influenced the events that led to the lost decade the most was the dynamics of the accident. The fact that when Cliff died, the others were right there with him, they were together, they weren't locked away in their mansions or palaces. It was something that could have happened to all three of them, and I think it was a shock almost equal to the loss of a dear friend. My opinion is that, in a way, they subconsciously blamed the way they lived and toured, meaning the classic thrash tours of the time with buses traveling across America and Europe, covering 400 kilometers a day under any conditions, etc. I believe that from that moment on, again subconsciously, they started to move away from the thrash scene, perhaps not sonically at first, but certainly in how they approached their careers. It's no coincidence that their next major tour, the Damaged Justice Tour, did not feature thrash bands as the main support acts, but artists like Danzig, Faith No More, and The Cult, who had nothing to do with that scene. Of course, the new management company they signed with, the multinational Q Prime, a company that managed bands outside of thrash, Dokken, Tesla, Smashing Pumpkins, Hole, etc., also pushed them in that direction. It definitely elevated them and brought them closer to the inner circles, so to speak. They were the first thrash band to play at the Grammys, and their performance made a huge impression despite not winning. What I would say was the culmination of all the effort to break away from the thrash scene and enter the musical elite was the fact that they didn't participate in the Clash of the Titans tour, which was practically the peak of thrash and featured three of the big four on the American leg, excluding Metallica, of course, who were working on the Black Album at the time. The tour lasted 2 months, and they could have stopped working and participated. They were already in the remix stage anyway, but they didn't. I've definitely said a lot about the Black Album in other videos, and you've commented quite a bit as well, and I don't want to repeat myself. I think we all know how the album sounded and where things led. Metallica became the biggest rock band in the world and one of the wealthiest. They lost some of their more extreme metal fans, but they gained so many outside of thrash that they didn't care at all. Of course, they were still a metal band, but now they were playing in a different league. The connection to their thrash past had been broken. In my opinion, the journey towards this recognition and the absolute peak had begun with the accident. Now you'll tell me, they would have attained great levels of success anyway, because they had the talent. I agree. The band already stood out, even compared to the other big four, and even before the accident. But I don't think they would have gone that far. They wouldn't have cut themselves off that much. But beyond the tragedy, Another reason that led to the lost decade was the 3 years of incredibly exhausting touring that followed the Black Album. During this period, from August 1991 to September 1994, the band played 353 shows. Just think that in 1992 alone, they played 168 shows, which means they practically played a concert on half the days of the year. So, logically, when the tours finally ended and the band had to start working on the next album, all the members were completely burned out, both physically and mentally. I think they've admitted it themselves that just surviving these 3 years was an achievement. Finally, there is definitely a third parameter we need to take into account. How do you follow up an album like the Black Album? What do you do when you've reached the absolute peak? Metallica were 30 years old and had achieved everything a musician of the genre and the scene they belonged to could achieve. If they were athletes, we could say they had won the Super Bowl, or the World Series, or the Olympics, or the World Cup. They had more money than they could have imagined anyone could make. They went to awards ceremonies and galas, where they mingled with world-renowned celebrities, while 10 years ago, they were all living together in a house in San Francisco, rehearsing in its garage. It's not easy to handle a situation like this.
The window burns to light the way back home.
Metallica's lost decade began in 1994 when the band started working on what would become their sixth album. Here's how it went. Hetfield and Ulrich first got together in a studio. The latter had set up at his home, wrote various demos, and then took 30 of them to a regular studio where they would record to shape them up, fix them, so to speak, so they could be included on the album. This retouching, with input from the other two and especially Hammett, took them a year. 14 of these songs made it onto the album, which was titled, as we know, Load, and was released in the summer of 1996. For the first time in the band's history, Kirk Hammett shares rhythm guitar duties with James Hetfield, after the encouragement of Lars Ulrich. Hammett said this was done to achieve a looser sound. On the other hand, all of Newsted's song ideas were dismissed by Hetfield, in the end deciding to record them himself in his newly built studio. The band decided to incorporate many influences from what they were listening to at the time into their new work. As a result, we can hear elements from boogie rock, hard rock, alternative rock, stoner rock, blues rock, and even country in the final product, while leaving very little room for metal, reminiscent of even the Black Album. For thrash, of course, there's no question. The album received a lot of criticism from their fans, who felt it was too great a departure from their sonic roots, a betrayal of the sound that made them big. For me, it's an excellent album that simply shouldn't have been released under the name Metallica. If someone else had made it, we would consider it a masterpiece today. I also disagree with their choice to take so many risks on one album. I think the average fan had too many changes, too many experiments to process, which made it so difficult for them to accept it. However, even if a fan was positively inclined and wanted to like the album, it was impossible to overlook the other changes that accompanied it. The band, or as we'll see, some people within its ranks, had decided to take the whole alternative phase all the way, in everything, not just the sound. Thus, the band's image changed radically. They cut their hair, started wearing makeup, and clothes that resembled 1950s gay pimps. But that wasn't all. In the music video for Until It Sleeps, we couldn't recognize them. The album cover was an abstract expressionist work that the world had no idea what it meant, and even the band's logo changed, becoming less sharp, both figuratively and literally. Lars also made statements about modern art, saying the band isn't heavy metal and things like that. We also had this whole thing where Lars and Kirk were pretending to be gay. At some concerts, Lars and Kirk made it look like they were making out, while there's also this scene from Headbangers Ball that I'm not going to comment on, I am not saying that all this was a bad thing. Everyone is free to do as they please. I am just questioning the motives behind it. For me, it's clear that they were trying to piss off their core, quote, uncultured, unquote, metal audience, as well as a certain other member of the band. James Hetfield spoke about that in 2009. The whole "we need to reinvent ourselves" topic was up. I couldn't get into it. I would say at least half the pictures that were to be in the booklet I yanked out. The cover went against what I was feeling. Lars and Kirk were very into abstract art, pretending they were gay. I think they knew it bugged me. I think the cover of Load was just a piss take around all that. I just went along with all this crazy, stupid shit. All of this reinvention process culminated logically in them agreeing to headline Lollapalooza. For those who don't know, Lollapalooza was the leading alternative rock festival of the era in America. It was founded by Perry Farrell of Jane's Addiction and featured a wide variety of sounds, ranging from alternative metal, industrial, grunge, alternative rock, post-punk, etc. Of course, there was nothing of the pure metal that Metallica played before Load. It was also a festival that considered itself more than just a music event. It defined itself as a reaction against multinational corporations, big interests in music, what was called corporate rock in America. Now, back then, in the eyes of an alternative fan, Metallica was the epitome of corporate rock. It's another matter whether there were bands at the festival that sold millions and had signed with multinational corporations. So, when Metallica played there, it caused reactions not from the metal fans, but from the alternative ones. Their choice received so much criticism that Perry Farrell left the festival, while many say it was the beginning of the end for Lollapalooza, which will cease to exist after a year. The usual festival attendees were saying that everyone was going to see Metallica, that the festival was filled with metalheads, that those who went didn't care about the other bands, that the whole vibe was very macho, whatever Lars and Kirk were doing, and so on. I think the whole situation was a wake-up call for the band, who realized they weren't alternative and would never become alternative, no matter what they played or how much they changed their image. So when they released their next album, November 1997's Reload, they toned down their image a lot, and all the stuff with the makeup and the band's strange appearance was dropped. Of course, the cover remained incomprehensible, and the logo was the new one again. But you can't have everything your way. Musically, for me, Reload is an album where the band simply overdoes it. There was no reason to fill 76 minutes with the rests of Load, for God's sake. After a certain point, the songs are indistinguishable from each other. They are boring and uninteresting, and they prove that there was a reason they weren't included on Load. For me, they should have released an EP that included Fuel, The Memory Remains, Devil's Dance, Fixer, and maybe Where the Wild Things Are, and that's it. Let's also say that Hetfield has repeatedly stated that he didn't agree with the musical direction of the two albums as well, and simply decided to follow the vision of Ulrich and Hammett, who were so passionate about the whole project. Specifically, he said, "As far as doing something that doesn't feel right, I'm sure there's been a few times that it's happened. The Load and Reload era, for me, was one of those. The way that was looking, I wasn't 100% on with it, but I would say that that was a compromise." I said, "I'm going with Lars and Kirk's vision on this. You guys are extremely passionate about this, so I'll jump on board. Because if the four of us are into it, it's going to be better." So I did my best with it, and it didn't pan out as good as I was hoping.
When it comes to being the soothing light at the end of your tunnel.
Now, due to various circumstances, we'll see, the band, which stopped touring for Reload in mid-1997, won't start working on new music again until the spring of 2001. In these almost 4 years, they will only create 3 original songs, but various events will occur that will affect the band's future and confirm the view that this was indeed a very strange decade for Metallica. Let's see. First, the musical side. In 1998, they recorded a covers album to which they added the then hard to find 1987 EP Garage Days Revisited, as well as various other covers they had recorded over the years. The idea behind this album wasn't bad, and the selection of the new songs they covered, okay, not all of them, brought them again somewhat closer to the metal audience. For example, we probably weren't expecting a 10-minute medley of Merciful Fate songs. In April 1999, they recorded a live album with the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra, which was released that November under the title S&M. That also turned out to be a good idea, which many people later copied, although on the album itself, the songs that had the greatest response were the old ones, and, truth be said, the whole endeavor probably concealed the fact that for some reason they weren't deciding to record new music. The album contained two new songs, one of which, No Leaf Clover, eventually became a new classic for the band. Finally, in late May 2000, the original song, I Disappear, was released for the soundtrack of the film Mission Impossible 2. It's a pure rock track, perhaps the furthest Metallica ever strayed from heavy metal in their history. Now, besides music, gradually throughout the decade, Lars Ulrich started taking the whole "we're relaxed, we're playing it loose" thing very seriously, and became particularly careless in his playing. Since the band's inception, one of their core principles has always been that when they play live, they give it their all and perform their songs as well as they can. Ulrich started losing time, going off beat, and this whole situation, exacerbated during that 4-year period by the reckless use of a certain powder coming from Colombia, really bothered Hetfield and deepened the rift between them even further. Let's say that since then, the Dane has had this aura of not being a good drummer, despite that, according to his own words, he improved his playing over the years. Let's now move on to something else. When I Disappear leaked online about a month before its official release from the then relatively new file-sharing company called Napster, Metallica filed a lawsuit against it in the Northern California District Court, which was followed by a similar lawsuit from 18 major record labels. The band, which then discovered that its entire discography was available from the service, was seeking $10 million in damages, effectively $100,000 per song. This led to 300,000 users being blocked from the service, who, of course, could log back in under a different name, with a small change in the Windows registry. The series of lawsuits that followed led to the company's bankruptcy and fall, which, as we know, didn't change the situation much, because many other similar platforms sprung up in Napster's place. And of course, the case not only didn't yield any tangible results, but it also severely damaged the band's prestige and reputation. The drummer, with all the world's cameras on him and Hammett in the audience, testified before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, where he accused Napster of copyright infringement. Hetfield was absent from the whole affair because, as he said, it coincided with the birth of his second child, son Castor. The publicity the issue received made Metallica a target for practically all music lovers, as well as other bands like Limp Bizkit, who openly supported Napster. MTV, Smelling Blood, practically pitted the drummer, who participated in a sketch criticizing Napster, and the service's founder, Sean Fanning, who appeared to present an award against each other at the 2000 VMAs. The audience showed whose side they were on when they booed the Danish musician very loudly during his introduction of the last artist of the evening. But the stories didn't end there. In December 2000, the band's bassist, Jason Newsted, having grown tired of time passing without the band doing anything, suggested to the others that they all take a year off to regroup. During this period, he would release and promote the album of his personal band called Echo Brain. His proposal was rejected, and James Hetfield even forbade him from making any musical moves outside of Metallica. This caused significant discomfort for the bassist, who announced his departure from Metallica in January 2001. I remind you that according to statements by Newsted himself, when he joined the band, he was the victim of relentless bullying from his bandmates, a situation that continued for at least 3 years and culminated in the absence of the bass from the And Justice for All album, as well as the refusal of the others to accept his musical ideas. Despite all this, he persisted, because as he said, it was his dream, and in the end, he earned an equal position alongside the other three. In fact, regarding Hetfield, let's not forget that Newsted clearly took the singer's side in the matter of the image change in 1996, as well as on other issues within the band. Shortly after Newsted's departure in April 2001, the band's infamous Playboy Interview was published, which had been conducted before the bassist announced his official departure, so he was presented as a regular member. This is a terribly revealing and fascinating interview that shows a band in deep crisis, with many unresolved issues on the verge of collapse. For example, when they were answering questions, the four members were in 4 different locations in America, while Ulrich and Hetfield hadn't spoken to each other for over 6 months. It's in this interview that Newsted airs his grievances about the others, various bullying stories, etc., essentially foreshadowing his departure. But that's not all. Hetfield says that Ehrlich is a spoiled rich kid who always got his way, and the Dane responds that he is incredibly different from Hetfield and that their differences become more pronounced over the years. Hetfield admits that he's not the smartest in the band, so he often resorts to violence and intimidation to win an argument. Both Hammett and Ehrlich accuse Hetfield of being homophobic, with the latter even suggesting it's because he's not comfortable with his sexuality, and many, many more. For those interested, I will put the link to the interview in the video description.
I'm judging, I'm jury, and I'm executioner too.
In April 2001, without a bassist, and after almost 5 years without working on a new album, the band finally entered the studio, in their own space, as they had converted a decommissioned military camp into a recording studio to start working on their 8th album. Until they found a bassist, producer Bob Rock was decided to fill that role. The recording process was cut short very quickly for their own standards, as James Hetfield entered an alcohol rehabilitation center in July 2001. The band's singer and guitarist will return in December 2001, while recording will finally resume in April 2002. In fact, Hetfield had explicit instructions to participate in the project only from 12 noon to 4 p.m. every day. With the resumption of recordings and seeing how the relationships between the members were going, the band decided to hire a personal enhancement coach, psychiatrist Phil Towell. He was present every day during the recordings and was paid $40,000 a week to tell the band things that, honestly, seem obvious to any reasonable person when you hear them. But apparently Metallica wanted to hear them from someone else. We know all this because the band also decided to allow a film crew to record everything that was happening in the studio. Out of the shoot came a documentary that was later released in the public, entitled Some Kind of Monster. Watching it, you understand very well why the future album turned out the way it did. We see a band detached from reality, trying to resolve the various internal issues that have plagued them for years, while simultaneously attempting to make an album. For example, we see how Ulrich and Hammett were still processing Newsted's departure. Ulrich lashing out at Hetfield, who had criticized his bad playing and various other happenings. At the same time, producer Bob Rock, who had mercilessly pressured them in previous recordings, especially on the Black Album, made no attempt to bring them back to reality or comment their sonic choices, agreeing to everything they were coming up with, because deep down, he wanted to become the new bassist himself. The whole story ends with the, as it turned out, extremely successful hiring of Robert Trujillo to replace Newsted in February 2003 and the album's release in June of the same year. I think the whole process had a cleansing dynamic that was very good for the band and very bad for the album, which, even today, 23 years after its release, still sounds terrible. In it, Metallica prove once again that they are the masters of the heavy metal riff, but their good intentions and original ideas are placed in an almost random order, hermetically sealed within a cacophony of ill conceived and inexplicable sound choices. The album was like pulling teeth, necessary to avoid pain, but you wouldn't do it again for anything. And thankfully, they didn't do it again. But if you thought our story ended here, you're mistaken. There's one last literal episode. On May 3rd, 2003, the American MTV dedicated an episode of its series MTV Icon to Metallica. In this series, the music channel honored an artist considered a cultural monument, and each episode featured various famous people who had either been influenced by the artist or were fans of theirs, performing covers of their well-known songs. Do you know who was invited to pay tribute to Metallica by covering their songs? Sum 41, Stained, Avril Lavigne, Snoop Dogg, Korn, and Limp Bizkit. Indeed. Okay, I understand that the choices of artists who performed were the result of discussions between program directors and band managers, and I understand that those who would appear on such a show had to be relatively famous. But regardless of that, how did the band allow their name to be associated with these artists who gave us moments like this? Or this one? And why wasn't even one pure heavy metal artist invited, since the aim of the program was to pay tribute to perhaps the greatest heavy metal group of all time? Could it be that because their new album was primarily new metal sounding, they let all this hullabaloo happen in order to reconnect with the youth of that time, especially after the Napster case? Fortunately, they made amends 8 years later with the Fillmore concerts for the band's 30th anniversary, where they invited the right people.
Turn up the lights, halo on fire.
The 22 years since the lost decade have passed rather quietly compared to what came before. The band released 3 regular albums, all firmly within the realm of metal or even thrash, and all, in my opinion, at a level ranging from satisfactory to excellent. The fact that they wrote an 11-minute masterpiece like Inamorata in their 60s says a lot. Otherwise, I would say that the band had only 2, let's call them missteps, in these 22 years. One was when they gave Lou Reed one last chance to troll the global music scene shortly before he left us too, with the indescribable Lulu, an album that makes Saint Anger sound like an ABBA record. The other was when they decided to organize their own festival, to which, however, they invited bands that they themselves were listening to at the time, only to realize that what they were listening and what their fans were listening were 2 very different things. So, the festival closed after just 2 editions. If we put that aside, we see that they made a conscious effort to return to their roots, first with the Big Four tour in 2010, then with the Fillmore concerts in 2011, and finally with their very significant participation in the documentary Murder in the Front Row. Despite the focus being more on Exodus than on them, they even returned to the house where they lived in their early years in San Francisco and even tried to buy the garage, where they wrote Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets. So I will close this video with what I promised in the beginning as a conclusion. Were the wilderness years between 1994 and 2003 a lost decade? Initially, it's the band themselves that thought of the period in that way. After the Saint Anger tours ended, they wouldn't touch the Load and Saint Anger tracks in their live shows, preferring only some Reload songs, mostly Fuel, and occasionally The Memory Remains and Devil's Dance. This changed a little after 2020 with the return of King Nothing from Load, not surprisingly the most metal song from that album. Plus Dirty Window from Saint Anger, again, not surprisingly, probably the album's best song, and No Leaf Clover from S&M. Of course, the fact that they now play two consecutive nights in each place with two entirely different sets played a role into them making more unusual song choices. Thus, concerning the band themselves, this was kind of a lost decade since they play only a 2 to 3% of their musical output during these years in their extended live sets. As for the non musical aspects, it is obvious that James Hetfield was not very happy with what happened. And I should say that the band is trying very hard to forget and make us forget a lot of the things that took place during these years. Now, as for the fans' perspective, first I'll tell you mine. I still listen to Load today and I still believe it's a classic, albeit too experimental album that should never have been released under the Metallica name. I still don't care about Reload with the exception of the songs I mentioned earlier, and despite all my good intentions, I still cannot listen to Saint Anger because of the weird sonic choices that totally destroy an otherwise very interesting album. The covers album is good, but it is a covers album. As for the non musical choices, for me it was better if that decade never happened. I mean, they went from blunder to blunder, with the biggest one being their very conspicuous effort to deny their past and dissociate themselves from the scene and the culture that made them into the biggest rock stars of the planet. And despite the fact that they corrected all this in the following years, some fans will never forget and never forgive them for that. The only good thing that this decade brought was the hiring of Trujillo, which literally saved the band. If you want a purely personal opinion, during that period, for various reasons, James Hetfield let the other two assume control of the band, and what happened, happened. When, after 2003, he got sober and again became the band leader he was in the 80s, things got back to normal. I have to say, though, that this was a rotten way to treat Newsted, his best friend in the band. So, was it a lost decade? Well, maybe not entirely, but pretty close. Of course, I can't wait to hear your comments on that assessment.